Hey guys, tonight we begin with medieval sleep rituals. And trust me, they were absolutely bonkers. If you think your bedtime routine is complicated because you have to charge 3 devices and remember to set 2 alarms, wait until you hear what medieval folks had to do just to close their eyes without dying. So before you get comfortable in your lovely modern bed with actual springs and hygiene, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially those of you brave enough to watch this right before bed. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey through the absolute circus that was medieval sleeping. Let's start with the biggest misconception about medieval sleep. Everyone thinks medieval people just flopped down on some hay and called it a night, like they were basically human-shaped farm animals with slightly better table manners. In reality, going to bed in medieval times was more complicated than assembling IKEA furniture while blindfolded and slightly drunk. This wasn't some romantic pastoral scene where peasants dreamed sweetly under starlit skies. It was an elaborate survival ritual that would make Navy SEALs weep. Think of it like this. If modern sleep preparation is like ordering takeout, medieval sleep preparation was like hunting. Killing, skinning, cooking, and praying over your dinner while simultaneously building the table, making the plates, and hoping the wolves outside don't break down your door. Every single night was basically a small-scale military operation against death, demons, and really determined fleas. The medieval period was essentially humanity's awkward teenage phase, old enough to have some big ideas, young enough to implement them in absolutely ridiculous ways. Medieval Europe wasn't some quaint fairy tale land of noble knights and fair maidens. It was more like a continent-sized episode of Survivor, where everyone had terrible hygiene and genuinely believed that bathing would kill them. The Catholic Church controlled pretty much everything, from what you ate to when you slept to how you positioned your body while unconscious. Because apparently, even your dreams needed proper religious supervision. If you thought medieval people just lay down and hoped for the best, think again. They had more bedtime superstitions than a modern wellness influencer has morning routines. The church taught that sleep was dangerous because it left your soul vulnerable to demonic possession, which sounds dramatic until you realize they also thought demons could enter through your mouth if you yawned without making the sign of the cross. Meanwhile, medical authorities, and I use that term very loosely since their idea of surgery was let's just remove whatever looks suspicious, believed that sleeping wrong could literally rearrange your internal organs like furniture. In a college dorm room, your average medieval peasant had to navigate more nighttime dangers than a horror movie protagonist. We're talking about people who genuinely believed that if you didn't follow proper sleep protocols, you could wake up pregnant with a demon baby, cursed with permanent hiccups, or worse, transformed into a night-wandering ghoul who would be forced to terrorize your own village. And these weren't just old wives' tales. These were official church, doctrine, and medical advice that people staked their eternal souls on. Meet Brother Anselm of Canterbury. Not the famous saint, but a 12th century monk whose sleep diary survived to this day, and oh boy, is it a wild ride. Brother Anselm was obsessed with proper Christian sleeping techniques, which apparently was actually a thing. He documented every aspect of monastic sleep culture with the dedication of a modern fitness influencer tracking macros. But here's the twist. This guy was absolutely terrified of sleeping. According to his writings, Brother Anselm spent 3 hours every night preparing for bed because he was convinced that improper sleep positioning would result in either demonic possession or his soul accidentally leaving his body and getting lost like car keys. He had a 47-step bedtime routine that included specific prayers for each body part, blessing his pillow with holy water, positioning his bed to face Jerusalem, and sleeping with a consecrated rope tied around his waist, presumably so God could yank him back to his body if his soul started wandering off. The best part? Anselm documented having recurring nightmares about oversleeping and missing morning prayers, which he interpreted as Satan's attempts to make him lazy. So this poor man was literally losing sleep over losing sleep, in a cosmic anxiety loop that would make modern insomniacs feel grateful for their simple problems, like work stress and student loans. He eventually developed what he called holy insomnia, staying awake to pray all night because he decided sleep was too spiritually risky. And if you think that's obsessive, wait until you hear about the elaborate sleep rituals the entire communities practiced, involving everything from communal dream interpretation sessions to specialized sleep guardians, whose job was literally to watch other people sleep and wake them up if they looked like they were having suspicious dreams. This wasn't just about getting a good night's rest. Medieval sleep was literally a matter of life, death, and eternal damnation. People genuinely believed that the way you slept could determine whether you woke up as yourself, as someone else entirely, or not at all. The church taught that sleep was when devils did their shopping, browsing through unguarded souls like they were at a spiritual Walmart. But it gets worse. Medieval medical theory claimed that sleeping in the wrong position could cause your vital organs to slide around inside your body like items in a poorly packed suitcase. Sleep on your left side, your heart might tip over. Sleep on your stomach, your liver could flip upside down. Sleep with your mouth open? Congratulations, you're now a demon hotel. Women faced additional challenges because medieval authorities were convinced that female dreams were extra susceptible to diabolic influence, probably because they assumed women were naturally more gullible. Pregnant women had to follow even more elaborate sleep rituals to prevent their babies from being born with demonic characteristics, which apparently included being left-handed or having birthmarks in suspicious shapes. The complexity of medieval sleep culture reveals just how desperate people were to control the uncontrollable aspects of human existence. But Brother Anselm's neurotic bedtime routine was just the beginning of medieval sleep madness. The real fun started when entire communities got involved, creating collective sleep rituals that were part religious ceremony, part medical procedure, and part elaborate group therapy session for a civilization that was basically having one long anxiety attack. Welcome to the wonderful world of medieval communal sleep management, because apparently, even unconsciousness needed a committee. Unlike our modern approach of close eyes, hope for best, medieval communities treated sleep like a collaborative art project where everyone had opinions and most of them were terrible. The church developed what they called supervised slumber, essentially a spiritual buddy system where nobody was allowed to sleep alone because solo sleeping was considered an open invitation for demonic interference. Think of it like a sleepover, except instead of gossiping and eating junk food, everyone was terrified of accidentally inviting Satan into their dreams. Monasteries pioneered this concept because monks were convinced that sleeping monks were basically unconscious sitting ducks in a supernatural shooting gallery. This wasn't just paranoid religious thinking, it was systematic theological policy. The church published official guidelines called dormitorium protocols that dictated everything from bed spacing, exactly 3 feet apart to prevent spiritual contamination, but close enough for protective proximity to approved sleeping. Positions on your back with arms crossed like you're already dead, which was considered the most holy position since it resembled a corpse prepared for resurrection. But here's where it gets really weird. These weren't just suggestions. Violating sleep protocols was considered a sin that required confession, penance, and sometimes public humiliation. Imagine having to explain to your priest that you accidentally rolled over in your sleep, and now your eternal soul might be compromised. Forgive me, Father, for I have slept sideways. The whole system developed because medieval people were absolutely convinced that unconscious humans were basically broken security systems. All the normal spiritual defenses were offline, leaving your soul vulnerable to any passing demon, wandering ghost, or malicious fairy who wanted to redecorate your personality. So, communities developed elaborate group sleep rituals that were part religious ceremony, part security protocol, and part the world's most anxious pajama party. Take the Abbey of St. Denis in 12th century France, where the monks developed what might be history's most elaborate communal sleep system. Every night, at exactly 9 p.m., all 200 monks would gather in the dormitory for what they called the Great Preparation, a 2-hour ritual that made TS, a security checks, look casual and efficient. First, each monk had to publicly declare his spiritual state, basically announcing whether he'd had any sinful thoughts that day that might attract demons during sleep. This wasn't a quick "I'm good" situation. It was a detailed confession that covered everything from pride to gluttony to accidentally enjoying the taste of their dinner too much. Brother Thomas allegedly once spent 45 minutes confessing to having impure thoughts about a particularly well-made loaf of bread, which sounds ridiculous until you realize that medieval people genuinely believed lustful thoughts about any earthly pleasure could create spiritual vulnerabilities that demons could exploit while you slept. Then came the physical inspection. Senior monks would examine each sleeping space for potential demonic entry points. They checked for cracks in the walls, demon highways, suspicious shadows, possible hiding spots, and anything that might be considered irregular, which included dust patterns that looked like sigils, cobwebs that formed questionable shapes, or straw that had arranged itself in ways that might spell words in Latin backwards. The actual sleeping arrangement was like a medieval game of Tetris designed by someone with severe OCD and a theology degree. Monks were positioned based on their spiritual rank, age, and current sin status. The holiest monks slept in the center because their spiritual power supposedly created a protective bubble, while newer monks formed defensive perimeters around them like religious human shields. Anyone who committed a recent sin had to sleep near the door, presumably, so demons would grab them first and leave. The spiritually clean monks alone died, but the real masterpiece was their dream guardian system. Throughout the night, designated monks would stay awake in shifts, walking between the sleeping monks and watching for signs of demonic interference. These signs included talking in sleep, obviously demon conversations, smiling while sleeping. Demons were apparently hilarious, moving too much, spiritual struggle, or sleeping too peacefully, suspicious lack of spiritual warfare. One documented incident from 1187 involved Brother Francis, who apparently giggled in his sleep and was immediately awakened by dream guardian Brother Matthew, who assumed Francis was being tickled by demons. The subsequent 3-hour exorcism ritual woke up the entire abbey and resulted in a formal investigation into whether their dormitory had adequate spiritual security. The final report, which survived in the abbey archives, concluded that Francis had probably eaten too much cheese before bed and recommended stricter dietary controls to prevent alimentary-induced spiritual vulnerability. Another abbey, Saint Germain-des-Prés, took a different approach and developed synchronized sacred slumber. All monks had to fall asleep simultaneously while reciting the same prayer, creating what they believed was a collective spiritual shield. The logistics were nightmarish. Getting 150 men to fall asleep at the exact same moment while chanting Latin required a level of coordination that would challenge modern military units. They appointed a sleep conductor who would signal when everyone should transition from prayer to unconsciousness. And apparently, this poor monk developed chronic insomnia from the pressure of managing everyone else's bedtime. The system, predictably, fell apart when Brother Augustine developed a snoring problem that disrupted the synchronized sleeping. Rather than accept that snoring was natural, the abbey spent 6 months trying various anti-demonic snoring cures, including tying his jaw shut, making him sleep with blessed herbs stuffed up his nose, and having other monks hold vigil specifically to pray for his respiratory system. Eventually, they just made him sleep in the chicken coop, which was considered less spiritually risky than allowing his snoring to compromise the entire community's collective dream security. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing in medieval life ever was. The more communities tried to control sleep, the more problems they created, like trying to organize cats while blindfolded and slightly panicked. Different religious orders had completely contradictory sleep theories that sparked what historians now call the Great Medieval Sleep Wars, theological arguments so intense they made modern debates about pineapple on pizza look civilized. Benedictines believed communal sleeping created spiritual strength through shared vulnerability, while Cistercians argued that group sleeping was actually dangerous because demons could jump from person to person like a supernatural game of spiritual hopscotch. The Franciscans took a middle approach and developed monitored individual sleep. Everyone slept alone but under constant observation, which was basically medieval Big Brother, except there. Surveillance was for your soul's protection rather than political control. This created its own problems when sleep monitors started having psychological breakdowns from watching people sleep all night. Every night. Brother William of Assisi reportedly quit his sleep monitor position after developing what he called nocturnal spiritual paranoia, becoming convinced that he was seeing demons everywhere because he'd spent too much time looking for them. Meanwhile, secular communities were developing their own sleep management systems that often contradicted church doctrine entirely. Village elders promoted traditional folk sleep, rituals based on pre-Christian beliefs that involved everything from sleeping with iron tools to ward off fairies to positioning beds according to lunar phases to prevent werewolf attacks. When church authorities tried to suppress these practices, communities often practiced both systems simultaneously, following church sleep protocols publicly while secretly maintaining their ancestral sleep traditions. This created a bizarre situation where people were essentially living double sleep lives. During church-supervised communal sleeping, they'd follow all the Christian protocols, but in their private homes, they'd revert to folk practices that directly contradicted everything they'd just done. Some people were literally blessing their beds with holy water and then immediately sprinkling salt in the corners to ward off witches, covering all their spiritual bases like taking both Tylenol and Advil for a headache. The contradictions became so extreme that some communities developed hybrid sleep systems that tried to incorporate both Christian and folk elements, resulting in bedtime routines that were more complicated than modern space shuttle launch procedures. People would pray to Christian saints while simultaneously performing pagan protective rituals, creating theological mashups that probably confused both God and the old gods equally. The result was a continent full of chronically exhausted people who were spending more time preparing for sleep than actually sleeping, like having a skincare routine that takes longer than the sleep it's supposed to improve. Church records from the period show a dramatic increase in what they termed sleep-related spiritual anxiety disorder, people becoming so stressed about sleeping properly that they developed insomnia, which they then interpreted as demonic interference, creating a feedback loop of supernatural panic that would make modern anxiety disorders look straightforward. Brother Benedict of Monte Cassino documented treating monks who were afraid to fall asleep because they were terrified of dreaming incorrectly, and afraid to stay awake because that was also spiritually dangerous. Village communities weren't faring much better. Town records from medieval German cities show increasing complaints about sleep disturbance disputes. Neighbors arguing about whose bedtime rituals were disturbing, whose bedtime rituals the city of Augsburg actually had to create. A sleep magistrate positioned to mediate conflicts between families, whose elaborate protective rituals were keeping each other awake. One recorded case involved a family who rang bells every hour all night to ward off demons, and their neighbors who played drums all night to scare away witches, resulting in a cacophony that prevented anyone from sleeping and probably attracted every supernatural entity within a 50-mile radius. Medical authorities responded by developing even more elaborate theories about sleep that somehow managed to make everything worse. Physicians began diagnosing spiritual sleep imbalance and prescribing treatments that included bloodletting before bed to reduce demonic attraction to excess humors, sleeping with various herbs and blessed objects, and following dietary restrictions so complex that people were essentially going to bed hungry and uncomfortable every night. The economic impact was staggering. Communities were spending enormous resources on sleep-related, religious, and medical services. Churches hired additional clergy specifically to manage sleep protocols. Monasteries built specialized dormitories with expensive architectural features designed to optimize spiritual security. And families spent significant portions of their income on blessed bedding, protective amulets, and consultation fees for sleep-related spiritual problems. Some villages went completely overboard and developed community sleep fortresses, buildings designed specifically for communal sleeping that looked more like religious bunkers than bedrooms. These featured multiple layers of blessed barriers, strategic positioning for maximum spiritual protection, and architectural elements that were supposed to channel divine protection while blocking demonic access. Essentially, they were building medieval panic rooms for sleeping, which is probably the most on-brand thing medieval people ever did. Meanwhile, as communities were turning bedtime into increasingly elaborate theological performances, individual families were developing their own private sleep traditions that were somehow even more bizarre than the communal versions. Because, apparently, when it came to medieval sleep anxiety, there was always room for innovation. The domestic sleep culture that emerged in medieval households was like communal sleep protocols, but with the added complexity of family dynamics, economic constraints, and the unique challenges of keeping multiple generations of people spiritually protected while unconscious in the same building. Parents had to manage not just their own sleep security, but also protect their children from demonic interference, ensure proper spiritual positioning for elderly relatives, and somehow coordinate all of this with limited space, resources, and patience. What developed was a fascinating world of family sleep hierarchies, domestic spiritual security systems, and bedtime power struggles that would make modern family bedtime routines look like simple, peaceful affairs. Each household became its own little kingdom of sleep management, with parents acting as spiritual security directors, children as unwilling participants in elaborate protective rituals, and everyone somehow managing to make the simple act of falling asleep into a nightly production that required more planning than a medieval wedding. And trust me, once you see how individual families approach the challenge of keeping everyone spiritually safe while unconscious, the communal approaches we just discussed will seem almost reasonable by comparison. If communal sleep management was medieval society's attempt at spiritual crowd control, then family sleep culture was like running a small supernatural security company out of your living room, except everyone was related. Nobody got paid, and the stakes were eternal damnation. Medieval domestic sleep practices were a completely different beast from the organized chaos of monastic dormitories. Where communities had formal protocols and designated officials, families had to improvise their own spiritual protection systems using whatever resources they could scrape together, which usually wasn't much. Think of it as the difference between a professionally managed hotel and a family camping trip, where Nobody remembered to pack enough tent stakes, and everyone's arguing about who gets to sleep closest to the fire. The fundamental challenge was that medieval families were essentially trying to run 24/7 spiritual security operations with no training, limited resources, and the added complexity of managing multiple age groups who all had different sleep-related spiritual vulnerabilities. Parents weren't just responsible for their own souls. They were the night shift supervisors for everyone else's eternal welfare, which is a level of parental responsibility that makes modern helicopter parenting look casual. But here's what made family sleep culture uniquely terrifying. Unlike monks who at least had some theological training, most medieval parents were making up their protective rituals based on half-remembered folk wisdom, contradictory advice from various religious authorities, and whatever seemed to work for their neighbors. It was basically crowdsourced spiritual security, which sounds about as reliable as it actually was. Medieval households developed elaborate hierarchical sleep systems that were part military organization, part family therapy session, and part nightly supernatural defense drill. The head of household became the sleep commander, responsible for positioning family members according to their spiritual vulnerability levels, coordinating protective rituals, and somehow ensuring that everyone survived the night without being possessed, cursed, or transformed into something embarrassing. And unlike communal sleeping where everyone was roughly the same age and spiritual status, families had to manage the unique challenges of protecting everyone from newborns who were considered spiritually defenseless to elderly relatives who were thought to be closer to death and therefore more attractive to various supernatural entities looking for easy targets. Consider the household of Thomas the Miller from 14th century Yorkshire, whose family sleep journal survived because his great-grandson donated it to a monastery, probably to get rid of evidence of his family's elaborate weirdness. Thomas had 7 children, 2 elderly parents, and a wife who was convinced that their house was built on cursed ground because the previous owner had died of suspicious hiccups every night. Thomas's family performed what they called the Great Positioning, a complex choreography that took nearly an hour and involved moving beds, children, and blessed objects around their 2-room house, according to that day's specific spiritual threats. Monday nights required different arrangements than Tuesday nights because different demons were supposedly more active on different days of the week. Thomas kept detailed charts tracking which family member should sleep were based on factors including recent sins, upcoming holy days, lunar phases, and whether anyone had seen unusual animals during the day. The hierarchy was strict and bizarre. Thomas and his wife slept in the center of the main room because as adults, they had the strongest spiritual defenses. The oldest children formed a protective ring around them, while younger children were positioned near blessed objects for extra protection. The baby slept in a specially constructed crib that was essentially a tiny fortress made of blessed wood, hung with protective amulets, and positioned exactly 3 feet from a crucifix because that was supposedly the optimal distance for divine protection without spiritual interference. But the real complexity came from Thomas's elderly parents, who had their own elaborate sleep requirements based on decades of accumulated folk wisdom and increasing paranoia about death. His father insisted on sleeping with his feet pointing toward Jerusalem, his head elevated exactly 6 inches to prevent his soul from draining out through his ears, and a blessed hammer under his pillow because he was convinced that demons were afraid of carpentry tools. His mother required a different setup entirely. She slept surrounded by specific herbs that had to be replaced weekly, with mirrors positioned around her bed to confuse any spirits trying to steal her remaining life force, and a complex system of strings tied to her fingers that would supposedly wake her if supernatural entities tried to manipulate her dreams. The nightly routine was exhausting. First, Thomas would inspect the entire house for signs of supernatural intrusion, checking for moved objects, unusual smells, or animals behaving strangely. Then came family confession time, where everyone had to declare any sins or spiritual vulnerabilities that might compromise the night's protection. His wife would bless each sleeping space with holy water while chanting prayers she'd learned from her grandmother, who'd learned them from her grandmother, creating a spiritual game of telephone that had probably transformed the original Latin prayers into complete nonsense. The children had their own roles in this nightly circus. The oldest son was responsible for checking that all the protective amulets were properly positioned. The daughters had to ensure that no iron objects were touching each other, which was thought to create spiritual disruptions. And even the youngest children, who could barely walk, had to perform simplified blessing rituals on their own bedding. One winter night in 1347, everything went wrong in spectacular fashion. Thomas's father's blessed hammer fell off the bed and hit the floor with a loud bang, which woke the baby, whose crying disrupted the protective prayer circle the women were maintaining, while simultaneously causing the family dog to start barking, which everyone interpreted as a sign of demonic presence. The resulting panic involved the entire family staying awake until dawn, performing emergency spiritual cleansing rituals, during which Thomas's mother became convinced that demons had entered through the hammer-dropping incident and spent the next week sleeping in the chicken coop because she considered it spiritually safer than the house. Another documented case comes from the household of Margaret, the weaver in 13th century Flanders, who developed what might be history's most complicated children's bedtime routine. She had 5 children under age 10, and she was absolutely convinced that children's dreams were basically demonic playgrounds where evil spirits went to have fun, corrupting innocent souls. Her solution was to create individualized spiritual protection systems for each child based on their age, temperament, and recent behavior. Each child had their own specific prayer sequence, blessed object arrangement, and sleeping position requirements. The process took over 2 hours every night and involved more costume changes than a Broadway musical, as each child had to wear different blessed garments depending on their spiritual needs that day. This wasn't isolated weirdness. Medieval families across Europe were independently developing similar elaborate domestic sleep management systems, like they were all following some cosmic instruction manual for making bedtime as complicated as possible. The patterns were remarkably consistent. Almost every medieval household developed hierarchical sleeping arrangements based on spiritual vulnerability rather than comfort or convenience. Parents universally positioned themselves as spiritual shields for their children. Elderly family members required specialized protective measures, and everyone had specific roles in maintaining the family's collective nighttime spiritual security. What's fascinating is how these systems developed in response to the same underlying anxieties that drove communal sleep practices, but adapted to the unique constraints of family life. Where monasteries could afford specialized architecture and dedicated personnel, families had to improvise using whatever resources they could find or afford. This led to incredibly creative and often ridiculous solutions to spiritual protection. Problems. Economic factors played a huge role in shaping these patterns. Wealthy families could afford blessed objects, specialized bedding, and consultation with religious authorities, leading to elaborate systems that resembled scaled-down versions of monastic sleep protocols. Poor families had to rely more heavily on folk traditions, improvised rituals, and whatever free spiritual advice they could get from neighbors, traveling priests, or elderly relatives with strong opinions about demon prevention. Geographic location also influenced family sleep culture significantly. Families living near monasteries often adopted modified versions of monastic practices, while rural families in areas with strong pre-Christian traditions maintained more folk-based approaches. Coastal communities developed additional protections against sea spirits and water demons, while mountain families had specialized rituals for altitude-related spiritual vulnerabilities that apparently nobody else had to worry about. The most consistent pattern was the development of what historians now call defensive sleep architecture. Families rearranging their living spaces, specifically to optimize nighttime spiritual protection. This involved everything from positioning beds to face specific directions, creating barrier systems using blessed objects and iron tools, establishing designated areas for different family members based on their spiritual status, and developing traffic flow patterns that would supposedly minimize demonic access routes. Perhaps most remarkably, these elaborate family sleep systems were passed down through generations like precious heirlooms, with each generation adding their own innovations and improvements. Families developed their own unique traditions that were as specific and detailed as modern family recipes. Except instead of cooking techniques, they were preserving methods for keeping everyone's souls intact during sleep. Children grew up learning not just how to perform their family's specific sleep rituals, but understanding the theological and practical reasoning behind each element, creating a folk expertise in supernatural security that was arguably more sophisticated than most formal religious education. The effects of these elaborate family sleep systems were far-reaching and often completely opposite to what anyone intended. While the goal was spiritual protection and family security, the reality was chronic exhaustion, increased anxiety, and children who grew up thinking that falling asleep was basically a nightly battle against supernatural forces. Medieval children raised in these households developed what modern psychologists would probably recognize as sleep-related anxiety disorders. They learned to associate bedtime with danger, vulnerability, and complex ritual requirements rather than rest and safety. Many adult medieval writings include references to childhood fears about sleeping incorrectly, suggesting that these elaborate protective measures often created more anxiety than they prevented. Parents suffered from what we might now call spiritual caregiver burnout, the exhausting responsibility of managing everyone else's supernatural security night after night, year after year. Medieval medical texts from the period describe increasing numbers of adults seeking treatment for chronic fatigue, persistent worry about family spiritual welfare, and what they termed excessive vigilance regarding nocturnal demonic activity. The economic impact on medieval families was substantial. Households spent significant portions of their limited resources on sleep-related spiritual supplies, blessed objects, protective herbs, specialized bedding, consultation fees for religious advice, and materials for constantly maintaining and updating their domestic spiritual security systems. Some families went into debt purchasing sleep protection supplies, treating spiritual security as a higher priority than nutrition or basic housing maintenance. But perhaps most significantly, these elaborate family sleep cultures created deep intergenerational connections through shared ritual practice. While the systems were often anxiety-inducing and exhausting, they also provided families with structured time together, shared purpose, and strong cultural identity. Children learned not just their family's specific traditions, but also gained detailed knowledge about spiritual protection, community cooperation, and ritual management that served them throughout their lives. The practices also had unexpected social benefits. Families with particularly effective or innovative sleep protection systems became community resources, sharing techniques and advice with neighbors. This created informal networks of domestic spiritual expertise that operated parallel to official church hierarchy, giving medieval people alternative sources of religious guidance and community support. Interestingly, historical records suggest that families with more elaborate sleep rituals often reported better overall family cohesion and cooperation in other areas of life. The nightly requirement for everyone to work together toward a common goal, surviving sleep spiritually intact, apparently translated into improved teamwork and communication during waking hours. It was like mandatory family team-building exercises. Except the stakes were eternal damnation, and the activities involved a lot more holy water than modern corporate retreats. Yet, even as families were developing these increasingly sophisticated domestic spiritual security systems, a darker and more dramatic aspect of medieval sleep culture was emerging, one that would make family bedtime routines look like peaceful lullabies by comparison. By the 13th century, sleep had become not just a personal spiritual battleground, but a public arena for some of the most intense and terrifying conflicts in medieval society. What started as individual anxiety about demonic interference during sleep evolved into community-wide panics, accusations of supernatural crimes, and dramatic confrontations that would shake entire regions. The transition from private family sleep management to public sleep-related crises happened gradually, then all at once. Communities that had spent generations perfecting their collective and domestic sleep protection systems suddenly found themselves facing threats that no amount of blessed bedding or protective positioning could address. We're talking about accusations of dream invasion, supernatural sleep crimes, and conflicts over sleep-related spiritual authority that escalated into what can only be described as medieval sleep wars. The stage was set for some of the most bizarre and dramatic episodes in medieval history, events that combined religious hysteria, community politics, and sleep-related paranoia into explosive situations that would define how medieval people understood the relationship between sleep, spirituality, and social order. What happened next would make everything we've discussed so far look like a peaceful bedtime story, and it all started with a single terrifying question. What if someone was deliberately using sleep as a weapon against their neighbors? By the late 13th century, medieval sleep culture had reached a breaking point that would make modern social media meltdowns look like polite disagreements. Communities that had spent generations perfecting their spiritual sleep security systems suddenly faced their worst nightmare: the possibility that all their elaborate protections were useless because someone was deliberately weaponizing sleep itself. The crisis began with what historians now call the Great Sleep Accusation Wave, a period when communities across Europe became convinced that certain individuals possessed the ability to invade, manipulate, or steal other people's dreams. This wasn't just theoretical theological debate. These were serious criminal accusations that resulted in trials, banishments, and occasionally executions. Imagine if your neighbors could accuse you of breaking into their dreams and rearranging their spiritual furniture, and the local authorities would take it seriously enough to put you on trial. The key players in this drama were an unlikely cast of characters: village-wise women who claimed to offer dream protection services, religious authorities trying to maintain control over sleep-related spiritual matters, community leaders attempting to restore order to increasingly paranoid populations, and ordinary people who were becoming convinced that their neighbors were engaging in supernatural sleep crimes. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Sleep invasion accusations weren't just about spiritual matters. They were about community trust, religious authority, and social control. If people couldn't trust that their sleep was private and protected, then the entire foundation of medieval community life was under threat. These weren't abstract theological questions. They were accusations that destroyed reputations, broke up families, and sometimes ended with people being burned at stakes. What made this crisis particularly explosive was that it combined all of medieval society's deepest fears: supernatural threats, religious uncertainty, community betrayal, and the terrifying possibility that all their elaborate protective measures were inadequate against human malice. The communities that had worked so hard to protect themselves from demons and spirits suddenly realized they might need protection from each other, which was somehow even more frightening than facing supernatural threats. The stage was set for confrontations that would reveal just how far medieval people were willing to go to protect their sleep, and how quickly spiritual paranoia could transform peaceful communities into battlegrounds of accusation, suspicion, and retribution. The most documented and dramatic of these sleep-related crises occurred in the village of Beaulieu in southwestern France during the winter of 1284, in what became known as the Dream Invasion Trials of Beaulieu, a 6-month legal and social catastrophe that reads like a medieval episode of a supernatural courtroom drama. It all started when Marguerite la Tisserand, a respected weaver and mother of 4, publicly accused her neighbor Agnes la Sagefemme, the village midwife, of deliberately entering her dreams to steal her weaving techniques. Now, this might sound ridiculous to modern ears, but in medieval context, this was essentially accusing someone of supernatural corporate espionage with eternal, spiritual consequences. Marguerite's accusation was specific and detailed in a way that made it impossible to ignore. She claimed that Agnes had been appearing in her dreams dressed as a giant spider, methodically examining her loom, memorizing her weaving patterns, and then disappearing with valuable trade secrets that Marguerite's family had guarded for generations. But here's where it gets really medieval. Marguerite also claimed that these dream invasions were leaving physical evidence. She was waking up with mysterious thread burns on her fingers and finding her actual loom rearranged in ways that matched what the dream spider had been doing. The village initially tried to handle this quietly through informal mediation, but Marguerite escalated by bringing in Brother Felipe, a traveling monk who specialized in what he called oneric spiritual violations, basically dream crimes. Brother Felipe examined the evidence, interviewed witnesses, and declared that Marguerite's accusations had theological merit because dream invasion was a documented form of supernatural assault that required formal ecclesiastical investigation. This is where things went completely off the rails. Agnes, who was apparently not going to take supernatural corporate espionage accusations lying down, counter-accused Marguerite of using dream manipulation to steal her midwifery knowledge. She claimed that Marguerite had been entering her dreams disguised as various pregnant women, forcing Agnes to reveal birthing techniques and herbal remedies that were traditionally passed down only through apprenticeship. The competing accusations created a theological and legal nightmare that required the intervention of both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. The local priest, Father Bernard, found himself trying to determine whether dream invasion was possible, whether it constituted theft if proven, and whether the church had jurisdiction over crimes committed while everyone was unconscious. Meanwhile, the village bailiff, Jean Le Prévost, was dealing with the civil aspects of what were essentially copyright infringement claims, involving supernatural transmission methods. He had to figure out whether stolen dream knowledge constituted actual theft, whether there was precedent for prosecuting unconscious crimes, and how to gather evidence for events that supposedly occurred in a spiritual realm that nobody else could access. The trial proceedings were absolutely bonkers. Both women were required to demonstrate their normal sleep routines in front of ecclesiastical observers to prove they weren't engaging in suspicious nocturnal spiritual activities. Marguerite had to show how she performed her nightly weaving protection prayers, while Agnes had to demonstrate her midwifery spiritual safeguards. Professional dream interpreters were brought in from neighboring monasteries to analyze both women's reported dreams for evidence of supernatural interference or manipulation. The testimony became increasingly elaborate as both sides brought in supporting witnesses who claimed to have their own experiences with dream invasion. Marguerite's sister testified that she'd been having dreams about being forced to reveal family recipes to mysterious hooded figures. Agnes's apprentice claimed that her own dreams had been invaded by someone trying to steal her knowledge of herb preparation. Soon, half the village was convinced they'd been victims of supernatural intellectual property theft. The climax came when Brother Felipe proposed what he called the Great Dream Trial. Both women would sleep simultaneously in the church under observation, and trained dream monitors would watch for signs of spiritual projection or invasion. This required constructing a special sleeping chamber in the church with blessed barriers, positioning multiple witnesses at strategic locations, and having both women fall asleep while ecclesiastical authorities watched them like they were dangerous criminals who might escape through the realm of dreams. The actual trial night was a disaster of epic proportions. Both women, understandably nervous about sleeping in public while being monitored for supernatural crimes, had insomnia. Agnes started snoring, which the observers interpreted as possible spiritual disturbance. Marguerite talked in her sleep, mentioning something about wool, which everyone assumed was evidence of the dream-weaving theft. Meanwhile, one of the dream monitors fell asleep during his shift and started having his own dreams, which everyone worried might compromise the spiritual integrity of the investigation. By dawn, nobody had proven anything except that it's nearly impossible to sleep normally when people are watching you for signs of supernatural criminal activity. But instead of concluding that the whole thing was ridiculous, the authorities decided that the lack of clear evidence proved how sophisticated the dream invasion techniques had become, requiring even more elaborate investigation methods. The response to the Beaulieu dream trials was swift, widespread, and completely unhinged. News of the case spread throughout the region faster than medieval gossip usually traveled, probably because it combined everyone's favorite topics: supernatural, crime, community drama, and people arguing about things that were impossible to prove. Other communities immediately began reporting their own dream invasion incidents, as if the Beaulieu case had given people permission to admit their supernatural sleep anxieties publicly. The Abbey of St. Sever documented 15 separate cases of accused dream theft within 3 months, including accusations of stolen prayer techniques, borrowed religious visions, and one particularly bizarre case where a baker accused a competing baker of entering his dreams to steal his recipes, which sounds ridiculous until you remember that medieval baking was serious business with closely guarded family secrets. Religious authorities were divided on how to respond. Progressive clerics argued that the whole thing was mass hysteria brought on by excessive sleep anxiety and inadequate theological education. Conservative authorities insisted that dream invasion was a real spiritual threat that required systematic investigation and stronger protective measures. The resulting theological debate lasted for decades and generated enough written arguments to fill multiple monastery libraries. Secular authorities found themselves in the impossible position of trying to create legal frameworks for prosecuting crimes that might not actually exist but couldn't be definitively disproven. Several regions developed dream crime statutes that established procedures for investigating supernatural sleep violations, creating what might be history's most impractical legal precedents. The immediate consequences were socially devastating. Communities that had previously cooperated on collective sleep protection suddenly became suspicious of each other's nighttime activities. Neighbors who had shared sleep security responsibilities for generations began viewing each other as potential spiritual predators. Trust networks that had taken centuries to build collapsed within months as people became convinced that anyone might be a secret dream invader. Economic effects followed quickly. Professional dream protection services became a booming industry as people sought specialized help for supernatural sleep security. Monasteries started offering spiritual sleep insurance, premium protection services for families who could afford enhanced dream security. Meanwhile, accused dream invaders often faced economic boycotts that destroyed their livelihoods, regardless of whether the accusations were proven. Perhaps most tragically, the crisis fundamentally changed how medieval people understood sleep itself. What had been viewed as a natural human necessity, requiring spiritual protection, became seen as a dangerous vulnerability that exposed everyone to potential attack from their own neighbors. Sleep transformed from a shared human experience that brought communities together through collective protective rituals into a source of suspicion, fear, and social division that would influence European sleep culture for generations. The dream invasion crisis of the late 13th century wasn't just about sleep. It revealed fundamental fractures in medieval society's ability to balance individual spiritual security with community trust and cooperation. This crisis showed how easily elaborate protective systems could transform into tools of persecution and social control. The same theological frameworks that communities had developed to protect themselves from supernatural threats became weapons for attacking each other. Religious authorities, who had spent centuries building their credibility as spiritual protectors, suddenly found themselves arbitrating impossible disputes that undermined their authority regardless of how they ruled. The cases also revealed the economic undercurrents of medieval sleep culture. Many dream invasion accusations involved people who were economic competitors, weavers accusing other weavers, healers targeting other healers, craftspeople claiming their trade secrets were being stolen through supernatural means. What appeared to be spiritual conflicts often masked very practical economic and social tensions that communities had no other way to address. Most significantly, the crisis demonstrated how medieval society's elaborate systems for managing uncertainty and vulnerability could become sources of even greater uncertainty and vulnerability. Communities that had invested generations in developing collective spiritual security discovered that their protective measures were ultimately powerless against human malice. Real or imagined, the legacy of the dream invasion crisis would shape European sleep culture for centuries, creating new anxieties, new protective measures, and new forms of social suspicion that fundamentally altered how people understood the relationship between sleep, spirituality, community, and individual security. Medieval sleep had become a battlefield, and nobody was sure who was winning. Around the main drama of medieval sleep wars, a fascinating cast of entrepreneurial characters emerged who turned the collective anxiety about sleeping into thriving career opportunities. These were the medieval equivalent of life coaches, security consultants, and wellness gurus, except their specialty was keeping people spiritually safe while unconscious. Meet Master Guillaume the Dream Reader, a 14th century Parisian who essentially invented the profession of nocturnal spiritual consultant. Guillaume claimed he could analyze anyone's dreams to detect signs of supernatural interference, predict future demonic attacks, and provide customized protection recommendations. His surviving client records show that he was basically running a medieval sleep therapy practice, except instead of helping people with insomnia, he was diagnosing spiritual vulnerabilities and prescribing elaborate ritual solutions. Guillaume's methods were impressively systematic for someone making everything up as he went along. He developed a standardized dream intake interview that covered everything from sleeping position preferences to recent sins, dietary habits, and family history of supernatural encounters. His diagnostic process involved having clients describe their dreams in detail while he consulted various charts, tables, and reference books that he'd apparently compiled himself from a mixture of theological sources, folk wisdom, and what appears to be pure imagination. The best part of Guillaume's operation was his treatment recommendations, which were so specific and elaborate that they probably took longer to implement than the original sleep problems took to develop. He prescribed everything from custom prayer sequences tailored to individual spiritual vulnerabilities, to sleeping position rotations designed to confuse potential demonic attackers, to dietary modifications that would supposedly make people's dreams less attractive to supernatural predators. One surviving prescription recommends that a client sleep facing southeast on Tuesdays and Thursdays, northwest on weekends, and rotating clockwise every 3 hours on feast days, which sounds like instructions for a spiritual compass that nobody actually needed than their sister Beatrice of Cluny, who represented a completely different approach to professional sleep management. Rather than analyzing dreams after they happened, Beatrice offered what she called preemptive dream defense, elaborate rituals designed to prevent problematic dreams before they could occur. She developed what might be history's first systematic approach to dream content control, creating specific prayer sequences that would supposedly influence what people dreamed about. Beatrice's specialty was working with families who were convinced their children were having inappropriate dreams that might compromise their spiritual development. She would visit households and conduct what she called dream environment optimization, rearranging bedrooms, blessing sleeping areas, and teaching parents how to influence their children's dream content through strategic positioning of religious objects and careful management of bedtime prayers. Her most popular service was something called spiritual dream scripting, advanced planning for dreams that would reinforce religious education and moral development. Parents could essentially commission specific types of dreams for their children, and Beatrice would design customized bedtime rituals intended to produce dreams about saints, biblical stories, or moral lessons. Whether this actually worked is questionable, but Beatrice apparently had a waiting list of families who wanted her to program their children's dreams like medieval spiritual television. Perhaps the most entrepreneurial character was Zhang the Sleep Guard, a former soldier who created what might be the world's first private sleep security service. After the dream invasion crisis made people paranoid about supernatural sleep attacks, Zhang saw a business opportunity and started offering professional overnight protection for wealthy families who could afford private spiritual security. Zhang's services included posting armed guards outside bedrooms during sleep hours, conducting hourly spiritual perimeter checks, and maintaining protective barrier systems throughout the night. His guards were trained to recognize signs of supernatural intrusion, including unusual sounds, suspicious shadows, and animals behaving strangely near sleeping areas. They carried blessed weapons and were authorized to wake clients immediately if they detected potential spiritual threats. The absurdity of Gene's operation was that he was essentially providing military-style security against threats that probably didn't exist. But his business was so successful that he expanded to multiple cities and trained dozens of professional sleep guards. His company motto was "Vigilant while you rest," and he offered different service levels ranging from basic overnight monitoring to premium protection that included pre-sleep spiritual sweeps, continuous dream monitoring, and emergency spiritual response teams. These weren't isolated entrepreneurial ventures. They were all part of an interconnected network of sleep-related services that created what might be history's first spiritual security industry. The relationships between these various sleep professionals were complex, competitive, and often completely ridiculous. Guillaume, the dream reader, and sister Beatrice developed what they called a comprehensive sleep wellness partnership. Guillaume would analyze problematic dreams and refer clients to Beatrice for preventive services, while Beatrice would send families with persistent dream problems to Guillaume for diagnostic evaluation. This created a referral system that kept families cycling between different types of sleep-related spiritual services, essentially creating medieval sleep therapy subscription models. But the partnership had an unexpected consequence. They started competing over whose methods were more effective. leading to what historians now call the Great Dream Professional Rivalry of 1298. Guillaume claimed that Beatrice's preventive methods were spiritually superficial and that only proper diagnostic dream analysis could provide real protection. Beatrice countered that Guillaume's approach was reactive and inadequate, arguing that preventing problematic dreams was obviously superior to analyzing them after spiritual damage had already occurred. This professional conflict escalated when both specialists started offering competing services in the same territories. Guillaume began providing his own version of preventive dream planning, while Beatrice started offering dream analysis services. Their competing claims about whose methods were more effective created confusion among clients and led to increasingly elaborate demonstrations of their respective expertise. The situation became truly absurd when both specialists were hired by the same wealthy merchant family, the Dubois household in Lyon, who wanted comprehensive coverage for all possible sleep-related spiritual threats. Guillaume and Beatrice found themselves working in the same house, providing conflicting advice about optimal sleep preparation, and essentially competing in real time to prove whose approach was superior. The Dubois family, apparently unaware that hiring competing sleep consultants might create problems, expected both specialists to coordinate their services. Instead, Guillaume and Beatrice spent most of their time undermining each other's recommendations and arguing about whose approach was more theologically sound. The family's sleep rituals became so complicated that they were spending more time preparing for bed than actually sleeping, while Guillaume and Beatrice continued their professional rivalry in their client's bedroom. Meanwhile, Zhang, the sleep guard, was building relationships with both specialists by offering security services for their clients who wanted physical protection in addition to spiritual consultation. This created a three-way professional network where dream analysis, preventive spiritual planning, and overnight security services were all packaged together as comprehensive sleep protection systems. But Jean's involvement added new complications, because his security protocols often conflicted with the spiritual recommendations from Guillaume and Beatrice. Jean's guards needed to move around the house, conducting perimeter checks, while the spiritual consultants required strict positioning and minimal disturbance during sleep rituals. The resulting conflicts over whose expertise took priority led to increasingly complex negotiations about how to coordinate spiritual and physical security measures. The interdependence between these services created what economists might recognize as an early example of market manipulation. Each specialist convinced clients that their individual services were inadequate without the others, creating artificial demand for comprehensive sleep protection packages that were probably unnecessary but definitely profitable. The network effect also spread geographically as successful sleep consultants in one city would recommend colleagues in other cities, creating referral chains that connected sleep professionals across regions. Wealthy families who traveled frequently could maintain consistent sleep protection services by working with affiliated consultants in different locations, essentially creating medieval sleep security franchises. Perhaps most significantly, these professional relationships influenced the development of sleep-related spiritual practices by creating feedback loops between different approaches. Guillaume's dream analysis methods influenced Beatrice's preventive techniques, while Jean's security protocols informed both specialists' understanding of potential threats. The result was increasingly sophisticated and elaborate sleep protection systems that were probably far more complex than anything the original theological authorities had envisioned. To understand how these elaborate sleep professions could thrive, you have to understand just how deeply sleep anxiety had penetrated medieval daily life. This wasn't just nighttime paranoia. Concern about sleep-related spiritual dangers affected how people planned their days, organized their households, and made major life decisions. Medieval people genuinely believed that sleep quality directly influenced everything from physical health to economic prosperity to family reputation. A bad night's sleep wasn't just personal discomfort. It was potential evidence of spiritual problems that could affect entire households. Families with members who experience persistent sleep difficulties often face social stigma because their sleep problems were interpreted as signs of inadequate spiritual protection or possible supernatural targeting. The cultural importance of proper sleep preparation meant that sleep-related expertise was genuinely valuable social currency. People who were known for effective sleep protection methods gained community respect and influence that extended far beyond nighttime hours. Conversely, individuals or families who experienced sleep-related problems often found themselves socially marginalized as people worried about associating with potentially spiritually compromised households. Daily life was structured around sleep preparation in ways that would seem obsessive to modern standards. Markets specialized in sleep-related supplies, with vendors offering everything from blessed bedding to protective amulets to specialized herbs for various types of spiritual sleep protection. Craftspeople developed entire product lines dedicated to sleep security, creating beds, furniture, and household items specifically designed to optimize spiritual protection during sleep. Religious calendar observances were closely tied to sleep practices, with different holy days requiring different sleep preparation protocols. People had to adjust their sleep rituals based on liturgical seasons, saints' feast days, and various religious observances that supposedly affected the spiritual atmosphere during sleep hours. This meant that medieval people were essentially following different sleep routines throughout the year based on the church calendar. Economic planning also revolved around sleep-related considerations. Families budgeted for sleep protection expenses the way modern families budget for healthcare or insurance. Travel planning had to account for maintaining proper sleep security away from home, which meant either bringing portable protection systems or arranging for appropriate spiritual accommodations in advance. Marriage negotiations included discussions about combining different family sleep protection traditions, and inheritance planning had to address who would maintain family sleep security systems after the deaths of household heads. Sleep had become so culturally significant that it influenced major life decisions and social structures in ways that created entire industries around managing nighttime spiritual security. Perhaps most ironic was how the elaborate systems designed to reduce sleep anxiety actually created more sleep problems than they solved. People who had hired professional sleep consultants often reported increased insomnia, not because of supernatural threats, but because they were so worried about following all the complex protection protocols correctly that they couldn't relax enough to fall asleep naturally. The contradiction was everywhere. Guillaume, the dream reader, who specialized in analyzing other people's dreams for signs of spiritual problems, reportedly suffered from chronic nightmares about failing to properly diagnose his clients' dream-related spiritual vulnerabilities. Sister Beatrice, who taught preventive dream planning, became so obsessed with controlling dream content that she developed what she described as spiritual dream performance anxiety, fear that her own dreams weren't sufficiently holy to maintain her professional credibility. Zhang, the sleep guard security services, created their own problems when clients became dependent on overnight protection and couldn't sleep normally without armed guards present. Some families who had used his services for extended periods reported being unable to sleep when traveling or in situations where professional sleep security wasn't available, essentially becoming addicted to spiritual security services. The professional sleep industry also created new forms of social inequality that contradicted medieval Christian ideals about spiritual equality. Wealthy families could afford comprehensive sleep protection that supposedly guaranteed spiritual safety, while poor families had to rely on traditional folk methods that were increasingly viewed as inadequate or potentially dangerous. This created a theological contradiction where salvation and spiritual protection became associated with economic resources rather than faith or moral behavior. Even more absurd was how the sleep protection industry began generating the very problems it claimed to solve. As professional sleep consultants promoted awareness of various spiritual sleep threats, communities became more anxious about these threats, leading to increased demand for protection services, which in turn created awareness of even more potential problems, generating a feedback loop of spiritual anxiety and commercial opportunity. The ultimate irony was that regions with the most sophisticated sleep protection industries often reported the highest rates of sleep-related spiritual problems. Areas where people had access to professional dream analysis, preventive spiritual planning, and security services consistently documented more cases of suspected supernatural sleep interference than communities that maintained simpler, traditional approaches to sleep protection. The professional solutions were apparently either attracting the problems they were designed to prevent, or creating heightened awareness that transformed normal sleep experiences into perceived spiritual threats. Everything changed when a single, devastating question emerged from an unexpected source. What if all of this elaborate sleep protection was actually making things worse? The question came from Brother Marcus of Padua, a 14th century Franciscan monk who had spent years studying the psychological effects of medieval sleep culture and reached a conclusion that would shake the foundations of centuries of spiritual sleep management. Brother Marcus wasn't some radical reformer or theological rebel. He was a respected scholar who had initially been a strong advocate for comprehensive sleep protection systems. He had spent the first decade of his career developing even more elaborate monastic sleep protocols and had written several treatises on proper spiritual sleep management. But in 1334, he published a bombshell document called De Somno Perturbato, on disturbed sleep, that fundamentally challenged everything medieval society believed about sleep and spiritual protection. His central argument was revolutionary in its simplicity. The elaborate rituals, professional consultations, and complex protection systems weren't protecting people from spiritual threats. They were creating spiritual anxiety that was far more damaging than any supernatural dangers they were supposedly preventing. Brother Marcus had documented dozens of cases where people with the most sophisticated sleep protection reported the most severe sleep problems, while communities with simpler, traditional approaches seemed to sleep peacefully without elaborate interventions. But what made Brother Marcus's critique particularly powerful was that he wasn't just offering theological theory. He had practical evidence. He had conducted what might be history's first systematic study of sleep quality, comparing communities with different levels of sleep protection complexity. His findings were shocking. People with access to professional sleep consultants reported sleeping an average of 2 hours less per night than people who followed simple, traditional bedtime prayers without elaborate rituals. The timing of Brother Marcus's revelation was perfect for maximum impact. By the 1330s, medieval communities were exhausted from decades of increasingly complex sleep management, economically strained from paying for elaborate protection services, and socially fractured from sleep-related conflicts and accusations. People were ready to hear that maybe they'd been making their problems worse through their attempts to solve them. The shift wasn't immediate or universal, but Brother Marcus's ideas spread through intellectual networks faster than any previous theological innovation. Monasteries began questioning their elaborate dormitory protocols. Families started simplifying their nightly rituals, and communities began challenging the authority of professional sleep consultants, who had built careers on promoting increasingly complex spiritual protection systems. What made this transformation particularly dramatic was that it wasn't just changing how people thought about sleep. It was challenging the entire medieval approach to managing uncertainty through elaborate ritual control. If centuries of sophisticated sleep protection were unnecessary or counterproductive, what did that say about other areas where medieval society had developed complex systems to manage spiritual and practical risks? The transformation didn't happen overnight, partly because dismantling centuries of elaborate sleep culture was almost as complicated as building it had been. Communities that had invested generations in developing sophisticated sleep protection systems couldn't just abandon everything without careful planning and significant social negotiation. The first wave of change came from progressive monasteries that decided to test Brother Marcus's theories by gradually simplifying their sleep protocols. The Abbey of Saint Benigne in Burgundy became an early adopter, reducing their nightly sleep preparation from 2 hours to 30 minutes and eliminating most of their elaborate positioning requirements and dream monitoring systems. The initial results were promising. Monks reported better sleep quality, reduced anxiety, and more time for other spiritual practices. But the change process faced massive resistance from entrenched interests. Professional sleep consultants weren't about to accept that their entire industry was based on counterproductive practices. Guillaume the Dream Reader published a scathing response to Brother Marcus called De Falsa Simplicitate, on false simplicity, arguing that reducing sleep protection would leave communities vulnerable to spiritual attacks that would make their current sleep problems seem trivial by comparison. The resistance created what historians call the Great Sleep Reformation debates, public theological arguments about whether simple or complex sleep approaches were more spiritually sound. These debates were held in major cities across Europe and attracted crowds that would rival modern sporting events. Except instead of cheering for teams, people were passionately arguing about optimal bedtime prayer lengths and whether blessed pillow positioning was theologically necessary. Sister Beatrice took a different approach and attempted to adapt her services to the new simplicity movement by offering what she called streamlined spiritual sleep solutions, essentially trying to maintain her business model while appearing to embrace simpler approaches. This created a bizarre middle ground where professional sleep consultants were competing to offer the most sophisticated simple solutions, which was probably missing the point of simplicity entirely. Meanwhile, Jaime the Sleep Guard faced a complete business model crisis. If elaborate sleep protection was unnecessary, then overnight spiritual security services were obviously obsolete. He initially tried to pivot by offering simplified security solutions, reduced protection services for families who wanted some professional oversight without full traditional coverage. When that failed, he attempted to rebrand his business as general household security rather than specifically spiritual sleep protection, which was basically admitting that supernatural sleep threats weren't actually the problem he'd been solving. Change process was complicated by generational differences in communities that had practiced elaborate sleep protection for decades. Older residents who had invested their entire adult lives in mastering complex sleep rituals were reluctant to abandon practices that had become central to their identity and social status. Younger people who had grown up exhausted by elaborate bedtime requirements were enthusiastic about simplification, but often lacked the knowledge to distinguish between genuinely useful traditional practices and unnecessarily complex additions. Some communities attempted compromise approaches that tried to maintain spiritual protection while reducing complexity. These modified traditional sleep systems often created more confusion than the original elaborate protocols because they required people to understand which elements were essential and which were optional, leading to inconsistent practice and anxiety about whether they were maintaining adequate protection. The most successful changes occurred in communities that approached to simplification systematically rather than randomly eliminating practices. These communities typically maintained basic blessing rituals and simple protective prayers, while eliminating elaborate positioning requirements, professional consultations, and complex monitoring systems. They discovered that people could maintain a sense of spiritual security with minimal ritual requirements if those requirements were consistent and genuinely meaningful rather than mechanically elaborate. Perhaps most significantly, the change process revealed how much of medieval sleep culture had been driven by social conformity rather than genuine spiritual conviction. Once communities received permission to simplify their practices, many people admitted that they had always found the elaborate rituals burdensome and anxiety-inducing, but had continued following them because they assumed everyone else found them genuinely helpful and spiritually necessary. The transformation also demonstrated the power of practical evidence over theoretical authority. Brother Marcus's documentation of improved sleep quality and simplified systems was more persuasive than centuries of theological arguments about optimal spiritual protection because people could verify the results in their own experience. Communities that experimented with simplified approaches almost universally reported better sleep, reduced anxiety, and improved overall quality of life. The new simplified sleep culture that emerged by the mid-14th century was dramatically different from the elaborate systems that had dominated medieval bedtime for generations. Instead of complex multi-hour preparation rituals, most communities adopted streamlined approaches that emphasize basic spiritual protection through simple prayers, minimal blessed object placement, and straightforward sleeping arrangements that prioritize comfort and family cohesion over theoretical spiritual security. The transformation was most visible in monastic communities, where dormitories that had operated like spiritual military installations became more like normal communal sleeping spaces. Monks maintained basic blessing rituals and continued sleeping in group arrangements for practical reasons, but eliminated the elaborate positioning requirements, dream monitoring systems, and complex hierarchy-based bed assignments that had made sleep preparation more exhausting than actual spiritual practice. Family sleep culture simplified even more dramatically. Households that had spent generations developing elaborate domestic spiritual security systems discovered they could maintain adequate spiritual protection with basic bedtime prayers, simple, blessed object placement, and sleep arrangements based on comfort and family needs rather than complex spiritual vulnerability calculations. Children who had grown up with anxiety-inducing bedtime rituals finally experienced sleep as rest rather than nightly spiritual warfare. The professional sleep consultation industry largely collapsed, though some practitioners successfully adapted by transitioning to general spiritual counseling or practical household management services. Guillaume the Dream Reader eventually became a scribe specializing in copying religious texts, while Sister Beatrice developed a successful practice teaching simplified prayer techniques for various life situations, not just sleep-related concerns. What emerged was a sleep culture that balanced spiritual awareness with practical common sense. People maintained basic, protective prayers and blessing rituals that provided psychological comfort and spiritual connection without the elaborate complexity that had created more anxiety than protection. The new approach recognized that spiritual security during sleep was important, but didn't require professional management or complex systematic intervention. The economic effects were immediate and positive. Families saved significant resources previously spent on sleep protection services and elaborate blessed objects, while communities redirected energy from sleep management to other practical and spiritual priorities. The reduced anxiety about sleep-related spiritual threats allowed people to focus on daytime spiritual development, and community cooperation rather than nighttime survival strategies. Perhaps most importantly, the simplified approach restored sleep's role as natural rest, rather than spiritual battleground. Medieval people finally discovered that they could maintain their religious convictions and spiritual protection while also getting adequate sleep, creating a more sustainable balance between spiritual awareness and basic human needs. The new reality proved that effective spiritual practice didn't require constant anxiety or elaborate ritual complexity, but could be maintained through simple, consistent, meaningful practices that enhanced rather than disrupted daily life. Was this simplification actually an improvement? From multiple perspectives, the answer appears to be overwhelmingly yes, though the transition wasn't without some genuine losses that deserve acknowledgement. The immediate practical benefits were undeniable: better sleep quality, reduced anxiety, lower costs, and more time for other spiritual and practical activities. Communities that adopted simplified approaches reported improved overall health, better community cooperation, and more sustainable spiritual practices that people could maintain throughout their lives without exhaustion or resentment. From a theological perspective, the simplification aligned more closely with core Christian teachings about faith, trust, and spiritual peace than the elaborate anxiety-driven systems that had developed over centuries. Many religious authorities concluded that the complex protection systems had actually demonstrated lack of faith in God's protection rather than sophisticated spiritual awareness. However, the transition did involve some genuine losses. The elaborate sleep rituals had provided communities with shared activities, cultural identity, and structured time for spiritual reflection that wasn't easily replaced by simpler practices. Some people genuinely missed the sense of collective purpose and detailed spiritual engagement that complex sleep management had provided, even if they acknowledged that the anxiety wasn't worth preserving. The simplification also eliminated some genuinely useful elements along with the unnecessarily complex ones. Traditional herbal practices, community cooperation systems, and family spiritual education that had been integrated into elaborate sleep cultures sometimes disappeared along with the problematic elements, requiring communities to deliberately preserve useful traditions while abandoning counterproductive additions. Overall, most medieval people who experienced both systems concluded that simpler approaches were spiritually and practically superior, though they acknowledged that the transition required careful attention to maintain beneficial elements while eliminating anxiety-producing complexity. In the decades following the Great Sleep Reformation, medieval communities discovered that simplifying their sleep culture had unleashed a cascade of unexpected consequences, some wonderful, some problematic, and some just plain weird. Turns out that when you spend centuries building elaborate systems around basic human activities, dismantling those systems creates gaps that need to be filled, often in ways nobody anticipated. The immediate aftermath was mostly positive chaos. Communities that had redirected their energy from sleep management to other activities experienced what historians now call the medieval productivity boom of the 1340s. Monasteries that had been spending 2 hours every night on sleep preparation suddenly had time for additional prayer, study, and manuscript copying. Families that had been exhausted by elaborate bedtime rituals found themselves with evening hours available for practical activities like extended meal preparation, craft work, and actual family conversation that wasn't focused on spiritual protection. Logistics dot, but the liberation from sleep anxiety also created some unexpected challenges. People who had spent their entire lives following detailed spiritual protection protocols sometimes experienced what we might recognize as decision paralysis. When faced with simplified approaches that required them to make their own choices about sleep practices, some communities requested guidance about how to choose which simplified rituals to maintain. essentially asking authorities to tell them how to be less dependent on authority, which was probably missing the point, but very typically medieval. The economic disruption was more complex than anyone had anticipated. While families saved money previously spent on sleep protection services, the collapse of the professional sleep consultation industry created unemployment for people whose entire careers had been built around managing other people's bedtime anxieties. Guillaume the Dream Reader's transition to manuscript copying was relatively successful, but many former sleep professionals struggled to find alternative employment, creating what might be history's first documented example of technological unemployment caused by common sense rather than actual technology. More significantly, the simplified sleep culture revealed how much medieval social structure had been built around shared anxiety management. Communities that had bonded over collective spiritual protection suddenly needed new ways to create social cohesion and shared purpose. Some groups successfully transitioned to other collaborative activities, but others experienced social fragmentation. As people realized they had less in common than their shared sleep anxieties had suggested, the generational effects were particularly interesting. Children who grew up after the simplification often couldn't understand why their parents and grandparents had such strong emotional attachments to elaborate sleep rituals that seemed obviously unnecessary. This created cultural tension between generations that had experienced different sleep management systems, with older people sometimes feeling that younger generations were spiritually complacent because they hadn't learned to take sleep-related spiritual threats seriously enough. The simplified sleep culture attracted a completely different type of spiritual entrepreneur than the elaborate systems had supported. Instead of professional anxiety managers like Guillaume and Sister Beatrice, the new environment favored what we might call practical spirituality consultants, people who helped communities maintain meaningful spiritual practices without unnecessary complexity. The most influential of these new figures was Sister Catherine of Toulouse, a Benedictine nun who developed what she called sustainable spiritual practice, approaches to religious life that could be maintained throughout a person's entire lifetime without burnout or resentment. Her work with sleep culture focused on teaching people how to distinguish between genuinely meaningful spiritual practices and elaborate rituals that have been added for their own sake rather than for genuine spiritual benefit. Sister Catherine's approach was revolutionary because she actually listened to people's experiences rather than imposing theoretical requirements. She discovered that most people found simple, consistent bedtime prayers more spiritually meaningful than complex rituals because they could focus on the spiritual content rather than worrying about proper execution of elaborate procedures. Her simplified sleep protocols maintained spiritual significance while eliminating the anxiety-producing elements that had made elaborate systems counterproductive. Another important new figure was Brother Thomas of Cluny, a former student of Brother Marcus who specialized in what he called community spiritual transition management, helping established communities adapt their traditional practices to simplified approaches without losing their cultural identity or spiritual effectiveness. His specialty was working with monasteries and villages that wanted to simplify their sleep culture, but were afraid of abandoning traditions that had been central to their community identity for generations. Brother Thomas developed a systematic approach to spiritual simplification that preserved the most meaningful elements of traditional practices while eliminating unnecessary complexity. His method involved having communities identify which aspects of their sleep rituals provided genuine spiritual benefit versus which elements had been added due to anxiety, social pressure, or professional consultation that hadn't actually improved their spiritual lives. Perhaps most innovative was Master Robert the Practical, a former merchant who became a lay spiritual advisor, specializing in what he called economic spiritual analysis, helping families optimize their spiritual practices for both meaningful religious engagement and practical household management. Master Robert's approach to sleep culture focused on developing bedtime routines that provided adequate spiritual protection while also supporting family budgets, time management, and overall household efficiency. Master Robert's methods were particularly popular with working families who needed spiritual practices that enhanced rather than complicated their daily lives. He developed simplified sleep approaches that could be easily taught to children, maintained during travel, and adapted to different seasonal work schedules without requiring constant professional consultation or expensive specialized supplies. These new spiritual advisors differed from their predecessors in fundamental ways. Where the earlier sleep professionals had built careers on identifying problems and selling increasingly complex solutions, the new practitioners focused on helping people develop sustainable spiritual practices that improved their overall quality of life. They measured success by reduced anxiety and improved community cooperation rather than by the elaborateness of the protective systems they recommended. The shift represented a fundamental change in how medieval people understood the relationship between spiritual expertise and practical living, moving from anxiety-based professional management to empowerment-based community education that helped people develop their own effective spiritual practices. But some problems persisted despite the simplification movement, proving that human nature could create complications even within the most streamlined systems. Medieval people demonstrated remarkable creativity in finding new ways to make simple things complicated, often defeating the purpose of simplification through their enthusiasm for improving on already adequate solutions. One persistent issue was what historians call simplification competitiveness, communities competing to develop the most perfectly simple sleep approaches, which inevitably made simplicity complicated. Villages would send representatives to observe other communities' simplified sleep practices and then attempt to create even more elegantly simple versions, leading to increasingly elaborate efforts to achieve perfect simplicity that defeated the entire purpose of reducing complexity. The Abbey of St. Denis, which had been one of the first to adopt simplified approaches, eventually developed a 47-step process for maintaining optimal simplicity in their sleep protocols, which was probably more complex than their original elaborate system but was justified as necessary for ensuring that their simplification remained properly simple. Brother Augustine documented spending more time planning how to keep their sleep rituals simple than they had previously spent on the actual rituals themselves. Another recurring problem was spiritual nostalgia syndrome, periodic community desires to return to more elaborate sleep protection systems during times of stress or uncertainty. When communities face challenges like crop failures, disease outbreaks, or political instability, some people would interpret these problems as evidence that simplified sleep approaches weren't providing adequate spiritual protection, leading to temporary reversions to more complex systems. These nostalgia episodes often created internal community conflicts between people who preferred simplified approaches and those who wanted to restore traditional elaborate protection. Some communities developed compromise systems that attempted to satisfy both preferences, usually resulting in approaches that were too complex for simplicity advocates and too simplified for traditionalists, pleasing nobody and creating more anxiety than either pure approach. The most persistent ongoing issue was what medieval documents describe as ritual drift, the tendency for simplified practices to gradually become more complex over time as people added small improvements, additional prayers, or extra precautions that seemed reasonable individually, but collectively restored much of the complexity that simplification was supposed to eliminate. Families that had successfully adopted simplified bedtime routines would gradually add elements like seasonal variations, special occasion modifications, guest accommodation protocols, and travel adaptations that were all individually logical but collectively recreated elaborate systems. Parents would add extra blessings for children's protection, modify routines based on advice from neighbors, and incorporate new spiritual practices they learned from visiting religious authorities, slowly transforming simple approaches back into complex ones without realizing what was happening. Communities struggled with maintaining simplification across generations as new members who hadn't experienced the problems of elaborate systems often assumed that more spiritual protection was obviously better than less, leading them to enhance simplified practices with additional elements that seemed spiritually beneficial but gradually undermined the practical advantages of streamlined approaches. Perhaps most frustratingly, the simplification movement created its own forms of spiritual anxiety among people who worried constantly about whether their simplified practices were adequate or whether they were being spiritually complacent by not doing more to ensure proper protection. Some people developed simplification anxiety disorder, fear that their streamlined spiritual practices weren't sophisticated enough to provide real protection, leading them to seek reassurance through professional consultation about whether their simple approaches were appropriately simple. Compared to the elaborate sleep protection systems of the 13th century, the simplified approaches that emerged after the Reformation were demonstrably superior in almost every measurable way. But the comparison revealed interesting insights about how medieval communities understood the relationship between spiritual practice and psychological well-being. The simplified systems consistently produced better sleep quality, reduced community anxiety, lower economic costs, and more sustainable spiritual practices that people could maintain throughout their lives. Communities that maintained simplified approaches for multiple generations reported stable spiritual satisfaction without the cyclical crises that had characterized elaborate protection systems. However, the comparison also revealed that elaborate systems had provided some psychological benefits that simplified approaches didn't automatically replace. Complex rituals had given people detailed activities for managing anxiety during uncertain times, structured community cooperation experiences, and clear roles for different family and community members that created social cohesion through shared purpose. Simplified approaches were more effective at their stated goal of spiritual protection, but sometimes left people feeling spiritually underemployed, like they should be doing more to demonstrate their religious commitment even when more activity wasn't actually beneficial. This suggested that medieval people sometimes valued spiritual busyness for its own sake, rather than focusing purely on spiritual effectiveness. Comparing medieval sleep culture to contemporary practices in other regions revealed that the European obsession with elaborate spiritual protection was somewhat unusual. Islamic communities generally maintained simpler sleep approaches focused on basic prayers and cleanliness, while maintaining comparable levels of spiritual satisfaction. Jewish communities had developed sophisticated approaches to bedtime prayers, but without the anxiety-driven complexity that characterized Christian practices. The comparative analysis suggested that the European tendency toward elaborate ritual systems might have been culturally specific rather than universally necessary for effective spiritual practice. Communities that had developed simpler approaches from the beginning seemed to achieve similar spiritual outcomes without experiencing the anxiety cycles that led European communities to develop professional sleep management industries. Most significantly, the comparison revealed that effective spiritual practice appeared to depend more on consistency, sincerity, and community support than on ritual complexity or professional management. Simple practices maintained with genuine commitment seemed to provide better spiritual outcomes than elaborate systems followed mechanically or anxiously, regardless of the specific religious tradition involved. By the late 14th century, Signs pointed to a fundamental transformation in how European communities understood sleep, spirituality, and the relationship between elaborate ritual and genuine religious practice. The changes weren't dramatic daily shifts, but rather subtle indicators that the entire medieval approach to sleep management was becoming obsolete. Like watching a massive cultural iceberg slowly melting while everyone was still arguing about the best way to navigate around it. The most telling sign was generational indifference among young people who had grown up with simplified sleep practices. Unlike their parents and grandparents, who maintained emotional attachments to either elaborate or simplified approaches, young adults in the 1380s and 1390s increasingly viewed the entire debate about sleep protection complexity as irrelevant to their actual spiritual lives. They were developing what might be called post-sleep anxiety spirituality, religious practices that barely considered sleep as a special spiritual concern requiring systematic management. University students, who represented the emerging educated class, began writing treatises that treated medieval sleep culture as historical curiosity rather than ongoing spiritual necessity. These young scholars had access to classical texts that revealed how Roman and Greek civilizations had maintained sophisticated spiritual practices without elaborate sleep protection systems, suggesting that the entire European obsession with nighttime spiritual security might be culturally specific rather than universally necessary. The economic factors were also undermining the sustainability of even simplified sleep protection systems. The Black Death had disrupted traditional community structures, reducing the social pressure to maintain collective spiritual practices while increasing emphasis on individual survival and practical efficiency. Communities that had lost significant portions of their population often abandoned elaborate community traditions in favor of simplified approaches that required fewer people to coordinate and maintain. Trade connections with other regions were exposing European communities to alternative spiritual approaches that achieve comparable religious outcomes with different methods. Merchants returning from Islamic territories reported sophisticated religious cultures that treated sleep as natural rest, requiring basic prayers but not systematic spiritual management. This comparative perspective made European sleep anxieties seem provincial and unnecessary rather than spiritually sophisticated. Perhaps most significantly, the surviving members of the original professional sleep consultation industry were aging out without training successors. The children of former dream readers and spiritual sleep advisors were choosing different careers, often in practical trades or emerging academic fields that seemed more relevant to changing social conditions. The specialized knowledge required for complex sleep protection systems was literally dying with the generation that had developed it. Religious authorities were also showing less interest in regulating sleep practices as they focused on more pressing theological challenges related to social upheaval, religious reform movements, and political instability. Sleep management was becoming a lower priority for institutional religious attention, essentially abandoning the field to individual choice and family tradition rather than official supervision. The final transformation of medieval sleep culture didn't happen through dramatic reformation or official policy changes, but through what historians now call cultural exhaustion. Communities simply stopped caring enough about sleep protection complexity to maintain elaborate systems, even simplified ones, as other concerns became more pressing and relevant to their daily lives. The symbolic end came in 1402, when the last documented professional sleep consultant, Master Henry the Dream Keeper, grandson of the original Guillaume the Dream Reader, officially closed his practice in Paris and became a regular scribe specializing in legal documents rather than spiritual dream analysis. His business records showed declining clientele over a 20-year period as families gradually stopped seeking professional advice about sleep-related spiritual concerns. not because they had found better solutions, but because they had stopped viewing sleep as a problem requiring professional solutions. Master Henry's final client consultation, preserved in his business archives, involved an elderly widow who wanted advice about whether her late husband's ghost might be disrupting her dreams. Instead of providing the elaborate spiritual analysis that would have characterized earlier dream consultation practices, Master Henry reportedly spent most of the session listening to the woman discuss her loneliness and grief, eventually recommending that she spend more time with neighbors and family rather than focusing on sleep-related spiritual interventions. His final professional act was essentially acknowledging that sleep problems were often symptoms of other life challenges rather than independent spiritual threats requiring specialized management. The last documented community sleep protection system ended in 1418 when the village of Saint-Marcel-les-Valence officially discontinued their traditional collective bedtime ceremonies. The village records indicate that the decision wasn't controversial or dramatic. The ceremonies had simply become poorly attended as residents found them less relevant to their current concerns than other community activities. The final ceremony involved only 7 participants, mostly elderly residents who admitted they were maintaining the tradition, primarily from nostalgia rather than genuine belief in its spiritual necessity. Monastic communities maintained simplified sleep protocols longer than secular villages, but even these gradually evolved into basic prayers and blessing rituals that were indistinguishable from general bedtime devotions practiced by non-monastic religious families. The last monastery to maintain specialized sleep management protocols was the Abbey of Cluny, which officially simplified their dormitory practices in 1445, converting their elaborate spiritual sleep architecture into normal communal sleeping arrangements that prioritize comfort and practical convenience over theoretical spiritual protection. The final attempts to preserve traditional sleep protection knowledge occurred in the late 15th century when some elderly practitioners tried to document their expertise for future generations. These efforts produced several surviving manuscripts that read like instruction manuals for managing problems that no longer seem to exist, describing elaborate solutions for spiritual threats that contemporary readers found difficult to understand or take seriously. The most poignant of these final preservation efforts was Sister Margaret of Auxerre's Compendium of Traditional Sleep Wisdom, completed in 1467 when she was 78 years old. Her introduction acknowledges that she was documenting practices that her own novices found unnecessarily complex and spiritually irrelevant, but she hoped that future generations might rediscover the value of systematic spiritual sleep protection during times of greater spiritual uncertainty. Sister Margaret's compendium was apparently never used as an instruction manual by subsequent generations, but it survived as a historical document that provides modern historians with detailed descriptions of practices that seem completely natural to medieval people but appear almost incomprehensibly elaborate to contemporary readers. Her work essentially became an unintentional museum of extinct spiritual practices rather than the practical guide she had intended. The transformation was complete by the early 16th century, when European sleep culture had evolved into approaches that would be recognizable to modern practitioners. Basic bedtime prayers for those who wanted them, minimal ritual requirements, and sleep understood primarily as natural rest rather than spiritual battleground requiring systematic management, professional consultation, or community coordination. The decline of medieval sleep culture resulted from a convergence of factors that made elaborate spiritual sleep protection seem both unnecessary and incompatible with changing social conditions. The transformation wasn't caused by single dramatic events, but by gradual shifts that undermined the cultural foundations that had supported centuries of sleep-related spiritual anxiety. The most fundamental cause was generational change, as people who had grown up with simplified sleep approaches reached adulthood without experiencing the anxiety that had driven elaborate protection systems. These generations had practical evidence that simple spiritual practices provided adequate protection without complex management, making elaborate systems seem like unnecessary complications rather than essential spiritual tools. Economic pressures also contributed significantly to the transformation. The cost of maintaining even simplified sleep protection systems became harder to justify as communities faced increasing economic challenges from political instability, climate changes, and social disruption. Families needed to prioritize survival and practical security over theoretical spiritual protection, making sleep-related expenses seem like luxuries rather than necessities. Educational changes played a crucial role as increased literacy and access to diverse texts exposed people to alternative spiritual traditions that achieve comparable religious outcomes without elaborate sleep management. University education produced scholars who approached religious practices analytically rather than accepting traditional complexity as automatically beneficial, leading them to question whether elaborate sleep systems were spiritually effective or merely culturally habitual. The decline of community cohesion that had supported collective sleep protection also contributed to the transformation. Communities that had lost population through disease, warfare, or economic migration often lacked the social infrastructure required to maintain traditional sleep management systems, forcing them to adopt more individualized approaches that were less elaborate by necessity. Perhaps most importantly, the philosophical shift toward understanding spiritual practice as internal personal relationship with God rather than external ritual management made elaborate sleep protection seem spiritually immature. Religious authorities increasingly emphasize prayer, contemplation, and moral behavior as the foundations of spiritual life, while treating ritual complexity as potentially distracting from genuine spiritual development. The success of simplified approaches also contributed to their own eventual abandonment, as people discovered that minimal spiritual sleep protection worked just as well as elaborate systems. This practical success reduced anxiety about sleep-related spiritual threats, making even simplified protection seem unnecessary for people who had experienced years of peaceful sleep without elaborate interventions. Medical understanding was slowly evolving toward more naturalistic explanations for sleep problems, reducing reliance on supernatural explanations that had justified elaborate spiritual protection systems. While medieval medical knowledge remained limited, increasing practical experience with sleep disorders suggested that most sleep problems had physical or psychological rather than spiritual causes. Finally, the cultural shift toward individual spiritual autonomy meant that people increasingly preferred developing their own simple spiritual practices rather than following traditional systems designed by religious authorities or professional consultants. The empowerment that had begun with sleep simplification gradually extended to other areas of spiritual life, creating a preference for personal spiritual responsibility over systematic external management that made elaborate traditional approaches seem paternalistic rather than protective. The immediate aftermath of medieval sleep culture's transformation was a period of quiet relief mixed with occasional nostalgia as European communities adjusted to approaching sleep as natural rest rather than spiritual challenge requiring systematic management. Most people who had experienced both elaborate and simplified approaches reported genuine gratitude for the reduction in anxiety and complexity, though some elderly residents occasionally expressed mild regret about the loss of community traditions that had provided social structure and shared purpose. The consensus seemed to be that the spiritual benefits of elaborate sleep protection had been outweighed by the practical costs and psychological stress. Religious authorities generally welcomed the transformation as it allowed them to focus institutional attention on what they considered more important spiritual matters like prayer, moral education, and community service rather than managing complex ritual requirements that had often created more anxiety than spiritual benefit. Many clerics privately admitted relief at no longer having to arbitrate disputes about optimal sleep protection techniques or evaluate claims about supernatural sleep-related incidents. Economically, the transformation freed up household resources previously spent on sleep protection services and elaborate spiritual supplies, allowing families to invest in practical improvements like better nutrition, housing maintenance, and educational opportunities for children. Communities redirected energy from sleep management toward practical projects like infrastructure improvement and economic development. The most significant immediate legacy was cultural learning about the relationship between ritual complexity and spiritual effectiveness. Medieval communities had discovered through practical experience that elaborate spiritual practices weren't automatically superior to simple ones, and that systematic approaches to managing uncertainty could sometimes create more problems than they solved. This lesson influenced how subsequent generations approached other areas of spiritual and practical life, creating skepticism about unnecessary complexity and preference for approaches that could be evaluated based on practical outcomes rather than theoretical sophistication. The experience of simplifying sleep culture provided a model for evaluating other traditional practices based on their actual effectiveness rather than their historical authority or ritual elaborateness. The legacy of medieval sleep culture shaped European approaches to spiritual practice, personal anxiety management, and professional expertise in ways that influenced social development for centuries after the last dream consultant hung up his blessed amulets and became a regular scribe. Perhaps most significantly, the medieval experience with sleep simplification provided later generations with a practical template for evaluating religious and social practices based on their actual effectiveness rather than their traditional authority or theoretical sophistication. The discovery that centuries of elaborate spiritual protection could be replaced with simple approaches that work better became a model for questioning other unnecessarily complex traditional systems. This lesson influenced the Protestant Reformation's emphasis on simplified religious practice and direct personal relationship with God, rather than elaborate institutional mediation. Reformers explicitly referenced the medieval experience with sleep culture as evidence that simpler spiritual approaches could be more effective than complex traditional systems managed by professional religious authorities. Martin Luther's writings include specific mentions of how communities had successfully simplified their spiritual practices in areas like sleep protection, using this as precedent for broader religious simplification. The economic lessons from the collapse of the professional sleep consultation industry also influenced later thinking about the relationship between expertise and practical problem-solving. Medieval communities had learned that professional management of personal problems could sometimes create dependency and anxiety rather than genuine solutions, making them more skeptical of other forms of commercial expertise that promised to solve basic life challenges through systematic professional intervention. Later generations inherited a cultural skepticism about spiritual entrepreneurs who built careers on promoting increasingly complex solutions to problems that might not require professional management. This skepticism influenced how European communities approached other types of specialized services, creating preference for local, practical solutions over expensive professional consultation for routine life challenges. The medieval experience also demonstrated how quickly elaborate cultural systems could transform when people discovered better alternatives, providing subsequent generations with confidence that traditional practices weren't necessarily permanent or optimal just because they had been maintained for centuries. This cultural learning contributed to the development of what historians call practical Reformation thinking, approaches to social change that emphasize gradual improvement based on evidence rather than dramatic revolution based on ideology. Religious authorities learned important lessons about the relationship between institutional control and genuine spiritual effectiveness. The medieval sleep culture experience showed that excessive religious regulation of personal practices could create anxiety and dependency rather than spiritual growth, influencing later approaches to pastoral care that emphasized individual spiritual development rather than systematic institutional management of daily life. Academic institutions inherited substantial documentation of medieval sleep culture that became important source material for studying the psychology of mass anxiety, the economics of professional expertise, and the sociology of cultural change. Medieval sleep protection systems provided later scholars with detailed case studies of how communities could collectively develop elaborate solutions to problems that were probably created by their attempts to solve them. The linguistic legacy was also significant. Many European languages retained vocabulary related to sleep protection and spiritual consultation that influenced how people understood the relationship between personal problems and professional solutions. Terms for various types of anxiety, spiritual consultation, and protective rituals that had originated in medieval sleep culture continued to shape how people described and approached personal challenges for generations. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval experience with sleep culture provided lasting cultural wisdom about the relationship between individual vulnerability and community support systems. Later generations understood that effective support for personal challenges required balancing individual autonomy with community assistance, avoiding both excessive dependence on external management and complete individualism that ignored the benefits of shared wisdom and mutual aid. Today, we can see remarkably direct echoes of medieval sleep culture in modern wellness industries, anxiety management systems, and professional consultation services that would probably make Brother Marcus of Padua shake his head in recognition. While reaching for his De Somnia Perturbato manuscript to update it for contemporary audiences, the modern sleep optimization industry mirrors medieval sleep consultation services in almost comical detail. Where medieval people had Guillaume the Dream Reader analyzing supernatural threats to their rest, we have sleep specialists, mattress consultants, and wellness coaches offering increasingly elaborate solutions to basic sleep challenges. Modern sleep hygiene protocols can be just as complex and anxiety-inducing as medieval spiritual protection systems, with detailed requirements for bedroom temperature, lighting, electronics management, supplement regimens, and monitoring technologies that would make medieval sleep protection seem simple by comparison. Contemporary biohacking communities have essentially recreated medieval approaches to systematic life optimization, except instead of protecting against demons, they're optimizing against suboptimal performance metrics. Modern biohackers track sleep data with the same obsessive attention to detail that medieval families used for spiritual protection positioning, often creating more anxiety about sleep quality than actual improvement in rest. The parallels are stunning. Elaborate preparation routines, expensive specialized equipment, professional consultation services, and communities that bond over shared approaches to managing basic human vulnerabilities. Social media wellness culture has reproduced the medieval pattern of competitive elaboration, where people compete to demonstrate the most sophisticated approaches to simple problems. Instagram influencers promoting complex morning and evening routines that require dozens of steps, multiple products, and constant adjustment mirror the medieval tendency to assume that more elaborate spiritual protection was obviously superior to simpler approaches. The psychological mechanisms are identical: anxiety about optimization, leading to increasingly complex solutions that often create more stress than benefit. Modern sleep tracking Technology has created new versions of medieval dream monitoring, where people obsess over data about their rest patterns with the same intensity that medieval communities devoted to watching for signs of supernatural sleep interference. Fitness trackers and sleep apps can generate the same type of anxious vigilance that medieval dream guardians maintained. Except instead of watching for demons, people are monitoring for suboptimal sleep scores that might indicate inadequate wellness optimization. The contemporary supplement industry mirrors medieval markets for blessed objects and protective herbs, with people purchasing expensive products that promise to optimize their sleep through specialized ingredients that may or may not have actual benefits beyond providing psychological comfort. Modern sleep supplements and medieval blessed sleep aids serve similar psychological functions. They provide tangible actions people can take to feel like they're actively managing their vulnerabilities. Perhaps most remarkably, modern corporate wellness programs often recreate medieval institutional sleep management approaches. Companies that monitor employee sleep patterns, provide sleep optimization resources, and create policies around rest management are essentially providing updated versions of monastic sleep supervision, except the goal is productivity rather than spiritual protection. The institutional paternalism is nearly identical. The modern therapy and coaching industries have reproduced many aspects of medieval spiritual consultation, with professionals helping people develop elaborate systems for managing basic life challenges that previous generations handled through simpler traditional approaches. While modern psychological expertise is based on better understanding than medieval spiritual consultation, the pattern of professional management of personal problems can create similar dependencies and anxieties. Online communities devoted to sleep optimization, wellness culture, and anxiety management often develop the same types of competitive elaboration and professional hierarchies that characterized medieval sleep protection communities. People share increasingly complex strategies, debate optimal approaches with theological intensity, and sometimes develop anxiety about whether their optimization efforts are adequate or sophisticated enough. Most tellingly, contemporary discussions about digital detox and wellness simplification mirror medieval sleep reformation movements, with people discovering that reducing complexity in their optimization efforts often produces better results than elaborate, systematic approaches. Modern wellness culture is apparently going through its own version of Brother Marcus's revelation that sophisticated protection systems can create more problems than they solve. Even now, medieval sleep culture influences modern approaches to anxiety management, professional expertise, and the relationship between individual problems and systematic solutions in ways that most people don't recognize but would probably find familiar if they understood the historical parallels. Academic study of medieval sleep protection systems has become an important source of insights for contemporary researchers studying mass anxiety, social influence, and the psychology of wellness culture. Modern psychologists studying everything from health anxiety to social media-driven optimization culture regularly reference medieval case studies as examples of how communities can collectively develop elaborate solutions to problems that are often created or worsened by the attempted solutions. Popular culture has embraced medieval sleep culture as a source of both historical entertainment and contemporary commentary. Books, documentaries, and articles about medieval sleep rituals are often used to illustrate how easy it is for rational people to develop irrational responses to basic life challenges, providing perspective on modern wellness culture and optimization. Anxiety that might be difficult to see from inside contemporary systems. Political discourse occasionally references medieval sleep culture when discussing the relationship between expertise and common sense, particularly in debates about whether professional consultation and systematic approaches to personal problems are always superior to simpler traditional methods. The medieval experience with sleep simplification has become a historical example that different political perspectives used to support arguments about individual autonomy versus professional management of social problems. Religious communities continue to reference medieval sleep culture when discussing the relationship between spiritual practice and anxiety management. Many contemporary religious educators use medieval sleep protection as an example of how elaborate spiritual practices can become counterproductive if they create more anxiety than spiritual benefit, supporting arguments for simplified approaches to religious life that emphasize faith and trust over systematic ritual management. The business community has found medieval sleep culture relevant for understanding the life cycle of professional service industries, particularly how consultation services can create markets for problems that may not require professional solutions. Management education programs sometimes use medieval sleep consultation as a case study in how professional expertise can become self-perpetuating, even when it's not providing genuine value to clients. Perhaps most importantly, medieval sleep culture continues to provide contemporary people with historical perspective on their own anxiety management strategies and optimization efforts. Understanding how medieval communities developed elaborate systems around basic human activities helps modern people evaluate whether their own approaches to sleep, wellness, and personal optimization are genuinely beneficial or potentially creating unnecessary complexity and anxiety that might be better addressed through simpler approaches. The progression from medieval sleep anxiety to modern wellness optimization represents a fascinating evolution in how human communities approach the fundamental challenge of managing uncertainty and vulnerability through systematic intervention versus acceptance of natural limitations. What's remarkable is how similar the psychological patterns remain across centuries. People continue to develop elaborate systems for controlling aspects of life that may not require or benefit from systematic control, often creating anxiety through their attempts to eliminate anxiety. The tools and terminology change, but the underlying human tendency to assume that more sophisticated approaches are automatically superior to simpler ones appears to be remarkably consistent across different historical periods and cultural contexts. Medieval sleep culture and modern wellness culture both demonstrate how communities can collectively convince themselves that basic human activities require professional management and systematic optimization, leading to the development of entire industries around managing problems that previous generations handled through simpler traditional approaches or simple acceptance that some aspects of life involve uncertainty that can't be completely controlled. The historical progression also shows how cultural wisdom about the relationship between complexity and effectiveness can be lost and rediscovered repeatedly. Each generation seems to need to learn through experience that elaborate solutions aren't automatically superior to simple ones, and that professional management of personal problems can sometimes create dependence rather than empowerment. Perhaps most encouragingly, both medieval and modern experiences suggest that people are capable of recognizing when their optimization efforts have become counterproductive and can successfully simplify their approaches when they discover better alternatives. The medieval sleep reformation and contemporary movements toward wellness simplification demonstrate human capacity for cultural learning and adaptation when systems stop serving their intended purposes. The continuing cycle of elaboration and simplification in approaches to basic life challenges suggests that this tension between systematic optimization and natural acceptance may be a permanent feature of human culture rather than a problem that can be permanently solved through either more sophistication or greater simplicity. Looking back across our journey through medieval sleep culture, we've witnessed one of history's most elaborate examples of how human communities can transform basic biological necessities into complex spiritual battlegrounds, then gradually discovered that simpler approaches often work better than sophisticated ones, a lesson that apparently needs to be relearned by every generation in different contexts. We began with Brother Anselm's 47-step bedtime routine and his terror of spiritual sleep performance anxiety, discovering how individual neuroses about unconsciousness could evolve into institutional systems that made falling asleep more complicated than modern space missions. The progression from personal anxiety to community-wide sleep management protocols revealed how shared fears could create elaborate collective solutions that were often more exhausting than the original problems. The most surprising discovery was how quickly medieval communities could transition from viewing sleep as natural rest to treating it as a nightly supernatural security challenge requiring professional consultation, elaborate positioning systems, and constant vigilance against demonic interference. The transformation demonstrated remarkable human creativity in making simple things complicated, often with genuine conviction that complexity was obviously superior to simplicity. The development of professional sleep consultation services showed how anxiety-driven markets could create entire industries around managing problems that might not have required professional management, with entrepreneurs like Guillaume the Dream Reader and Sister Beatrice building careers on increasingly elaborate solutions to basic human vulnerabilities. Their success revealed how people would pay substantial resources for systematic approaches to controlling uncertainty, even when those approaches sometimes created more uncertainty than they eliminated. A dramatic peak during the Dream Invasion crisis of Beaulieu illustrated how elaborate protective systems could transform into weapons for community conflict, with accusations of supernatural sleep crimes revealing the social tensions underlying apparently spiritual concerns. The crisis demonstrated how quickly shared protective measures could become sources of suspicion and division when people became convinced that their neighbors might be using sleep as a battlefield. Perhaps most encouragingly, the eventual simplification movement led by Brother Marcus of Padua showed that medieval communities were capable of recognizing when their solutions had become counterproductive and could successfully transition to more effective approaches based on practical evidence rather than theoretical sophistication. The sleep reformation proved that cultural wisdom could triumph over institutional momentum when people had opportunities to compare different approaches and evaluate them based on actual outcomes. The gradual transformation toward modern approaches revealed how cultural change often happens through quiet, practical adaptation rather than dramatic reformation, as people simply stopped finding elaborate sleep protection relevant to their actual needs and gradually adopted simpler practices that worked better for their daily lives. Throughout this journey, the most consistent pattern was the human tendency to assume that more sophisticated approaches to basic challenges are automatically superior to simpler ones, followed by the eventual discovery that effectiveness often depends more on appropriateness and sustainability than on complexity or professional management. Perhaps the most perfect encapsulation of our entire journey through medieval sleep culture can be found in the final letter written by Master Henry the Dreamkeeper in 1402, just before he closed his consultation practice and became a regular legal scribe. This letter, preserved in the municipal archives of Paris, provides a remarkably honest reflection on his career helping people manage their sleep-related spiritual anxieties. Henry wrote to his cousin in Toulouse, after 20 years of analyzing dreams for signs of supernatural interference and designing elaborate protection systems for families convinced that demons were targeting their sleep. I have reached a conclusion that would have seemed obvious to anyone who wasn't making a living from sleep-related anxiety. Most people sleep better when they stop worrying about sleeping perfectly. He continued with what might be history's most practical spiritual advice. The families who hired me for the most complex dream analysis and elaborate protection systems often reported the worst sleep quality, not because they were experiencing more supernatural attacks, but because they were so anxious about following all the protection protocols correctly that they couldn't relax enough to fall asleep naturally. Meanwhile, my elderly neighbor who just says a simple prayer and trusts that God will watch over her sleeping seems to rest peacefully every night without any professional consultation or elaborate positioning requirements. Henry's letter revealed the personal cost of building a career around other people's anxieties. I became so focused on identifying potential spiritual threats to my client's sleep that I started having nightmares about failing to properly diagnose their dream-related problems. I was literally losing sleep over helping other people sleep better, which seems like evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire approach. But perhaps most poignantly, Henry described his decision to change careers. Yesterday, a young mother brought her infant to me because she was convinced that the baby's sleep patterns indicated possible demonic influence. After spending an hour analyzing the situation, I realized that this was simply a normal baby who needed more consistent feeding and sleeping schedules, not spiritual consultation. I found myself giving practical parenting advice rather than supernatural analysis, and both the mother and baby seemed much better served by common sense than by professional dream interpretation. Henry concluded with a reflection that perfectly captures the wisdom medieval communities eventually developed about sleep culture. I have learned that effective spiritual practice supports good sleep rather than complicating it, and that the most sophisticated protection systems are often unnecessary for people who maintain simple trust, reasonable spiritual practices, and practical approaches to managing their daily challenges. My clients didn't need professional dream analysis. They needed permission to trust that simple spiritual practices could provide adequate protection without elaborate professional management. His final observation was remarkably prescient. I suspect that future generations will find our elaborate approach to sleep protection as unnecessary and anxiety-producing as we now find some of the more extreme practices of our predecessors. Each generation seems to need to discover for themselves that effectiveness often depends more on simplicity and trust than on sophistication and systematic control. Master Henry's career transition from dream consultant to legal scribe represented more than personal change. It symbolized an entire culture's movement away from systematic, spiritual anxiety management toward more practical approaches to basic life challenges that honored both spiritual awareness and common sense. As we reach the end of our journey through the elaborate world of medieval sleep culture, it's worth appreciating how this historical adventure illuminates timeless aspects of human nature that continue to influence how we approach basic life. Challenges today dot the medieval experience with sleep protection. Systems offers gentle wisdom about the relationship between anxiety and solution seeking, reminding us that our instinct to solve problems through increased complexity isn't always our most reliable guide to effective living. Sometimes the most sophisticated approach is learning when sophisticated approaches aren't necessary. Perhaps most comfortingly, the story of medieval sleep culture suggests that human communities are remarkably capable of recognizing when their solutions have become more complicated than their problems and can successfully simplify their approaches when they discover better alternatives. This capacity for cultural learning and adaptation provides hope that we can continue to find better balances between addressing legitimate concerns and avoiding unnecessary anxiety about challenges that may be more manageable than they initially appear. The gentle evolution from elaborate medieval sleep protection to simpler, more sustainable approaches reminds us that progress often involves not adding more sophisticated solutions, but discovering which existing solutions actually serve our genuine needs and which ones we can peacefully release. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep in your comfortable modern bed, you might take a moment to appreciate the quiet wisdom that developed over centuries of human experimentation with rest, protection, and the eternal question of how much effort we need to put into activities that might benefit more from trust than from systematic control. You won't need to position your bed to face Jerusalem, bless your pillow with holy water, or worry about whether your dreams might be invaded by supernatural corporate espionage specialists. You don't need professional consultation about optimal spiritual sleep positioning or elaborate family coordination meetings about defensive sleeping arrangements. The complex systems that medieval communities developed with such sincere dedication have gently faded into historical curiosity, leaving us with the practical wisdom they eventually discovered. That effective rest often comes through simplicity, rather than sophistication. The medieval journey through sleep culture teaches us that human communities are remarkably creative in developing elaborate solutions to basic challenges, but also remarkably wise in eventually recognizing when simpler approaches serve us better. This capacity for both creative complexity and practical simplification seems to be one of our most endearing characteristics. As a species, we can elaborate our way into fascinating complications and then thoughtfully simplify our way back to sustainable solutions. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you might appreciate that you're participating in one of humanity's most successful practical reforms. The peaceful rest available to you represents centuries of cultural learning about the balance between spiritual awareness and practical common sense, between individual protection and community trust, between taking appropriate care and creating unnecessary anxiety. Sleep well, knowing that your rest is protected not by elaborate ritual systems or professional spiritual management, but by the accumulated wisdom of generations who learned, through extensive experimentation, that sometimes the most sophisticated spiritual practice is simply trusting that basic human needs can be met through simple, sustainable approaches that honor both our spiritual nature and our practical requirements for peaceful rest. Sweet dreams. And thank you for joining this journey through one of history's most charming examples of human creativity, community learning, and the eternal quest for peaceful sleep. In the quiet moments before sleep, medieval people and modern people share something fundamental that transcends the centuries between us: the universal human experience of vulnerability that comes with closing our eyes and trusting that we'll safely return to consciousness in the morning. This shared vulnerability connects us across time in ways that our different approaches to managing it cannot divide. The elaborate medieval systems for sleep protection and our contemporary optimization efforts both reflect the same underlying human impulse: the desire to transform uncertainty into control, vulnerability into security, and natural processes into managed systems. What the medieval experience teaches us is not that this impulse is wrong, but that it benefits from wisdom about when to engage it and when to practice trust in simpler approaches. The most beautiful aspect of the medieval sleep culture story might be how communities eventually learned to balance their spiritual awareness with practical common sense, creating approaches that honored both their religious convictions and their actual needs for rest. This balance suggests that effective living often involves integrating rather than choosing between spiritual consciousness and practical simplicity. Perhaps the greatest gift from our medieval ancestors' sleep culture experiments is the demonstration that human communities can learn from experience, adapt their practices based on evidence, and gradually develop wisdom about the relationship between effort and effectiveness in managing basic life challenges. Their journey from elaborate complexity to sustainable simplicity provides a template for how we might approach our own optimization efforts with both creativity and wisdom. The story reminds us that each generation inherits both the accumulated wisdom and the recurring challenges of previous generations, and that our task is not to perfectly solve the eternal questions about security and vulnerability, but to approach them with the best combination of spiritual awareness, practical common sense, and community support that we can manage. In this way, sleep becomes not just personal rest, but participation in an ongoing human conversation about how to live well with uncertainty, how to care for ourselves and others, and how to find sustainable approaches to challenges that may be simpler than they initially appear, but no less important for their simplicity.